Welcome to this workshop on equitable HR practices for farmers markets, hosted by the Oregon Farmers Markets Association. OFMA supports farmers markets across the state of Oregon with training, advocacy, and promotion. And we have monthly meetups for market staff so that market organizers from across the state can get together and talk with each other. There are open agendas to talk about what you do and share knowledge. Our next one is coming up on February 6th. We also have workshops on a monthly basis like this one. We're currently building 2024's schedule, but over on our website and event listings, you can check out what's coming next. I'll just put a link to that in the chat right now so you can go check those out. So a couple of things about how our sessions work. We hope you'll be comfortable here in our online world. Please feel free to be off camera if that helps you attend. We do love your participation though, so please ask questions and share what you know and how things are done at your market. You can put comments and questions and affirmations in the chat, and we'll let you know when we have Q&A time where you can come off mute and ask away. And in all you do here, please lead with kindness to this shared community. We'd love to hear you talk, but we also want you to listen to what people are saying and leave time for others to share as well. Okay, so today we're going to hear from Yana Ludwig, who is the Executive Director of the North Coast Food Web in Astoria, Oregon, where you can find the year-round North Coast online farmers market. Yana presented for the Oregon Community Food System Network on HR practices last year, and I saw that and thought how much we needed that info in our farmers market network. So here she is. I know we're going to learn a lot today. Thanks, Yana.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Amanda, and thanks, OFMA, for having me. I appreciate the chance to connect with all of you. And so I'll just say a smidge about my background so that you know kind of where I'm coming from with all of this. I am the executive director of North Coast Food Web. We're in Astoria, Oregon. I've been in this position for about 1.5 years, but I've been in the nonprofit sector since 1989, and I've been board member multiple times, professional staff, program staff, ED, all that stuff multiple times, and also have been for the last 15 years a consultant. And I work with intentional communities, which is kind of a whole world unto itself, but also a lot of work with worker-owned co-ops. That's been kind of a new niche in the last 10 years for me, and nonprofits. And I do increasing amounts of that work around equity and belonging. So those are like big themes that are sort of, through lines with all of the different kinds of work that I do. And I've also been a farmer. Used to manage a 3-acre organic garden and have been a chicken mama at various points in my life, including for sale. And, have been an avid participator in food co-ops and farmers markets pretty much my whole life. So this is very familiar territory for me. I, feel really blessed to be able to bring what may be some kind of provocative content into the farmers market world. We have been doing a lot of work at North Coast Food Web since I've been here to sort of transform our internal culture and really thinking a lot about what are the implications for the food system of embodying equity or not embodying equity in the practices that our organizations and businesses that are active in the food system are doing. So that's kind of the spirit that I'm coming to this with today. I also want to give you a couple caveats. One is that this is the second time, Amanda was there for the first time, the second time that I've presented this material. And I definitely welcome feedback about like how it's organized or where I need to be saying more, or maybe where you wish I had said less. So your feedback is welcome at the end of this. I want to get to a place where this information is as accessible as possible for folks. So I also have a little bit of a bias built into this. You'll see there's a few slides where I'll be talking about in the nonprofit sector, And I know that not all of you are nonprofits. I think that the core of what I'm going to be talking about applies regardless of what your structure is for your farmers market, but there are some specific things that I want to say about the nonprofit sector because that's the space that I play in the most. The other thing is that this isn't really the best way to do this conversation. There's a lot of information that I'm going to share. And so, as Amanda knows already, this is kind of like a 90-minute brain dump in some ways. And there's not going to be a lot time for us to be getting into like having a lot of conversations with each other. The slides will be available for you afterward though. So there's a bunch of, you can go down more rabbit holes, you can open up conversations within your farmers market. And I am happy to support those conversations happening in different places after we're done. But I just want to say, like, I know from an educational theory standpoint, doing an extended slideshow and me talking a lot is not necessarily the best way for folks to learn. So I'm really trying to just open a bunch of cans of worms that I hope you engage with ongoingly. So I think that's what I want to say as sort of, caveats and opening things. And I am going to go ahead and put it into screen share mode here. And slideshow mode. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and hop in to this. And so we're going to talk a lot about wages. We're going to talk about benefits. We're going to talk about hiring. Those are all really key places where we can either be doing a really good job with equity or kind of derfing it as far as like really taking care of people. And so those are the main places that we're going to focus on. All of these big topics could easily be a session unto themselves. So this is just going to be a lot of what I hope is kind of a perspective shift for a lot of people about how we think about HR practices. And I'm going to give you just this quick preview about when I'm talking about worker-centered HR, these are some of the course of concepts that I want to talk about today. So the first one is that I think a lot of times HR is designed to sort of dodge worker needs getting met. We're like protecting our organizations and we're protecting ourselves in terms of legal stuff. And I want us to really get good at actually codifying worker needs as part of how we're thinking about how we're structuring things fundamentally. There's also a shift that's embedded in that goes from like, what do we get as an organization or as a business to a shift we're going to be looking more at like, what are our workers giving or giving up in order to be working with us? Using equity as a core organizing principle. I'm going to talk about that mostly in the concept of in the areas of wages and thinking about hiring. And I just always try to encourage people to recognize that the folks who work on our markets, work in our nonprofits, we are mammals, we are not robots. We have actual physical bodies and physical needs. And sometimes our work is actually really good at hurting our mammal selves and treating us like robots. And I want us to actually kind of back away from that. I actually have a sign up right on the other side of my office door that says, remember, we are mammals, that is on display all the time for them. And I point at it regularly in staff meetings. Okay, so this is one of those nonprofit things. So just want to start out with like a little bit of data that like wages and benefits really matter. And so this data is from the nonprofit sector in the United States, and it's 2019. So this was actually before that thing where people are calling the Great Resignation, where a whole lot of people left their jobs because they were really not working for us. Even before that, though, almost 50% of the reasons why people leave is because compensation and benefits are not adequate for them to be able to meet their needs. And this is a really big deal. Like, I think that people get into, I'll call it social benefit work to also include, the farmers markets that are not nonprofits, but are still there trying to do a really good thing for our communities. And despite that motivation to be there, people leave a lot. And it's, one of the core reasons is wages and benefits. So it really matters the conversations that we're going to be having. So I'm going to get out of this mode for a second and actually ask this question. I want to open it up. And Amanda, if you can watch the chat for me, because I can't actually see it from where I am. I just want to ask an open question. Like, when we're thinking about how we set wages for our jobs, what typically is going into that? Like, how are wages typically set? What do you think?
People are saying available budget, benefits, industry standard,
Industry standard, yeah.
what the company can afford to pay.
Mhm.
One person said, not sure how typical it is, but the local livable wage.
Mhm. I wish that was typical. That would be great. Okay. Great. Yeah, so
Responsibilities taken on is another one. Oh, there's still more coming in.
Okay, great.
And wages set by the board of directors.
Uh-huh. Mhm. Okay. Anything else anybody wants to toss in? Mhm.
Experience, cost of living raises, take national averages and double them because New York.
Yeah.
As little as possible to comply with the law while keeping operating costs low.
Okay, as little as possible while complying with the law to, what was that?
While keeping operating costs low.
Costs low. Okay, great. All right. That's a pretty good list. And it does, there are a few things on here that are like, if your organization is more conscious, you're definitely doing that kind of thing. If you're not, then, some of the other stuff on the list kind of takes priority. And so I would say that this last one is almost like a good summary statement of some of the other things that have been said here, that often what it's about is like, how much can we get away with almost? And I know that a lot of your organizations are probably not doing that. And I hope that this webinar is actually affirming for you. But I do think that the typical thing is like, how little can we pay? And I've, as an executive director who's been tuned into equity stuff for a while, I have often had to really go to bat with my board about, where board members are saying, well, I know somebody who does that job for $16 an hour. Why can't we just pay that? And that kind of stuff, where it's like literally like, how much can we lowball it and still get somebody to warm our seats for us and show up to our markets once a week? And so I think this is a pretty typical package. And what I would say is, notice for a second, like, who is being centered in these kind of considerations? And what I would say is that the organization or the business, the owners, the management, that's who's being centered in this case. Very little of this is actually centering the worker and their needs. Cost of living raises, that's actually a raise thing, not a wage setting thing, but that is, centering the needs of the workers. Local livable wage, that one would be centering it. But I think that these are things that are often considered, like, if you get these out of your job, you work in a good place and you have a good job. And it's not necessarily typical. So what can we do? How can we do better on this front? Let's see. Okay, so let's get into the main content of this. And so I'm going to walk through most of these as like a longer thing, but there's 6 things that I really recommend to be able to like center the worker and not what the business or organization gets from them. And this is really a formula for how we embody equity in wages. So the first one is that you start with the living wages in your area. And I'll pop that open in a second here and we can look at what that means. Employing a wage ratio is something that, started in, I would say, some of the more radical worker co-op spaces, and is an idea that I'm attempting to spread, and I'm seeing more nonprofits picking this up. And so we'll talk about what wage ratios are. I'll also give you a tool for crafting a wage setting matrix so that wages are set in a way that's really fair and even-handed and is not necessarily about who is most effective at advocating for themselves, because that unsurprisingly tends to be white men who grew up in middle-class families tend to be really good at advocating for themselves, and the rest of us are not as good at it. So having some way to actually do this in a really even-handed way is important. Practicing pay transparency. So a lot of places tell you, a lot of employers tell you that you are not allowed to talk about how much you make with your coworkers. A, that's illegal, and B, it's actually a terrible practice, because what it does is it keeps a lot of people in a really disempowered place about their job. And so if we make it so that people don't have to ask uncomfortable questions, but we're actually really open about this is what everybody makes, that creates an environment where people feel like they can confirm for themselves that they're being treated fairly, and it puts pressure on us as bosses to be treating people fairly. We're going to talk about raises and why having them be non-negotiable, automatic, and tied to the cost of living is really important. And then we're also going to talk about why you should always pay people for all of their hours worked. That all word is really important, and it's pretty unusual. So let's look at this link. This is going to take us to this great thing. So this is the living wage calculator. This is MIT's website, mit.edu is where we're looking. And again, you'll get these slides, so you'll have all these links. You don't have to try to write that down and remember it. But what you can do is you can put, I'm going to put Clatsop County, which is where I am, in here. I'm going to tell it to go. Oops. Darn it, I got this to work earlier today. It was being a little glitchy. Fortunately, I opened it up. So here we go. That's what would have happened if it hadn't just glitched just then. So it actually gives you the lowdown on what is the minimum wage where you are. So this is Oregon minimum wage. Poverty wages are listed here, and then it's got living wages, and it's not a one number thing. It actually looks at, like, if you are a family, if you're a single person, what would actual living wages be in your area? And you know, in a country where I don't know if this is still true, but as of a few years ago, half of the jobs in the United States paid less than $16 an hour. So as you can see, that's like not really a livable wage for anybody unless you're two adults who are both working for that $16 an hour and you don't have any kids. It's not a living wage. And that's what most people, when they're out there, particularly early career professionals, are going to be used to seeing wages that are really low and really depressed. Now, obviously, it's different, you know, if you're in, you know, rural Tennessee, that's going to be different than the folks who are like in Brooklyn. You know, so the going wages in those different places is going to be different, and you know, depending on geography. And that's kind of the point of this, is that the living wage calculations are different depending on where you are. So coming back over here, I think this ought to be your starting place. So this is one thing that you ought to be doing. Whoops, sorry about that. Nope, 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 nope. There we go. Okay, so the first thing is looking at living wages. So the second thing is employing a wage ratio. I feel like this is kind of in a weird sort of kind of popped me out of full screen and kind of left me in full screen. I'm going to try to get it back to where it actually looks like full screen for you. There we go. Okay, so why have a wage ratio? So the number one reason is just that, like, wage ratios in the United States are completely out of whack. You know, CEO to worker pay on average in the US is about 400 to 1. So your average CEO makes roughly 400 times what their workers are making. It's a lot better in the nonprofit sector, but it's still not uncommon to have the big boss in a larger nonprofit making 10 times what the lowest paid person makes. So it's my theory that everyone's life force is equally valuable. That if you, whoops, where did that slide go? Huh, not sure where my slide went. Okay, there we go. So my basic premise around setting wages is that everybody is giving you the same hour of their life. So everyone who works for your organization is spending an hour working for you rather than reading a book, hanging out with their dog or their kid or their partner, going to enjoy the beach, working at another job. they are giving you an hour. And it doesn't matter if you are the CEO or the executive director of that organization or somebody who's there just as an administrative assistant. Like that hour is the same hour of give up that that person is doing in order to be there. And I think that when we're thinking about equity, having the starting place be that everyone's hour is worth the same amount to that person rather than it being wildly different. This is a side note that we're not going to get a chance to go into, but we also have a really big gulf between how we view white and blue collar work, how we view skilled and unskilled labor. And again, that is about what you're getting out of the person, not who that person is and what it means to their life that they're spending an hour in your service. Okay. So back to the wage ratio idea. So what a wage ratio is, the idea of using this concept really deliberately is setting a particular level for your business or organization that says that the highest paid person in the organization can't be making more than X times the lowest paid person. And we do this in part because it shifts the CEO and ED or the board's perspective to bringing everyone up with them rather than them just being able to raise their wage. So it could be totally fine for your ED and your organization to be making $100 an hour. But if you have a 2-to-1 wage ratio, they're going to have to actually get everybody else up to at least $50 an hour, and then they can do it. And that puts a different kind of motivation onto your CEO. So what's the right wage ratio? There isn't really one single answer to this, but I encourage organizations to grapple with it. I've worked with co-ops that have adopted a 3-to-1, which means if the lowest paid person was making 33 an hour, the highest paid person could be making 99 an hour. North Coast Food Web, the organization that I'm the head of, we use a 1.5-to-1 ratio, which means, and our organizational minimum wage at this point is $26 an hour. And so that means that as the ED, the starting wage for my position would be capped at $39 an hour. So if I want to be making more than that, I either have to work here long enough to get enough raises to be making more than that, or I need to bring everybody else up with me. And so one of my jobs during the first year and a half that I've been here is that thing of I've been working on bringing everybody else up with me. And so everybody's wages have gone up pretty significantly since I've been here. And then I finally was in a place where I could go to my board and ask for my raise. So typically you apply a wage ratio to starting wages, and there could be an optional second ratio for like absolute wages after raises get kicked in. So, but that's an option, that an organization can do. I mean, I'm keeping my eye on making sure that mine doesn't get above 2-to-1 for anybody else in the organization. So this is a pretty radical thing to do. This is one of the more radical things that I'm going to talk about today. And it's mostly radical because it's about the person at the top of the hierarchy actually doing a pretty big give to your organizational culture. And folks who are at the top of the hierarchy don't necessarily always want to do that, but that's where that's coming from.
Yana, people are asking if the hourly wages, are you talking about hourly wages only or with fringe and benefits included?
So we're going to get to talking about benefits. I mean, I'm talking right now about just hourly wages. But one of the questions that I'm going to talk about when we get to benefits is really thinking through who's eligible. So most benefit providers will let you set that standard. And so in our case, we've set a standard that anybody working 17.5 hours or more, which is the bottom that most benefit providers will allow you to do, gets full benefits along with everybody else. So I'm about to hire for a position that's a 25-hour-a-week position, and that person will have the exact same health coverage as everybody else. So what I'm talking about, the wage ratio, I'm just talking about the dollar per hour equivalent that that person's salary is based on, or the actual wages that they're making. Benefits are a different animal. Were there other questions that popped up there, or was that the main one?
That was it for now. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. Great. So I'm going to show you a tool here. I'm going to show you actually the wage setting matrix that we use here at the Food Web. And what this thing does, it's a not terribly complicated if you're into spreadsheets, but a kind of complicated spreadsheet that takes into account our minimum wage organizationally, our wage ratio, the specifics of each job's requirements, and the specific level of responsibility that each position has. So again, you'll get the link to this. Feel free to make a copy of this and create your own. You should be able to do that. But this is what it looks like. So let's see. There we go. So the first tab has like all of the different things that go into setting wages for a particular job. From experience level, in our case, food systems knowledge is a pretty important piece. Social skills, level of responsibility that you have for the org overall, for legal and economic responsibility, level of problem solving needed on the fly. So it's very systematic. It's got all of these different things. Some jobs are going to score really high on some of these and others are not. For instance, we may have jobs that require very little tech savvy and a lot of social savvy, for instance. And so that job would score differently on those two criteria. And then the second tab actually does a calculation for each job. And so every job, including my job, is run through this matrix, gets a score, gets an average number here. So that average. And then there's a multiplier that goes into that actually spits out what the hourly wage ought to be for this. And so basically what this adds up to is that, so our minimum wage organizationally, when you actually play things out, the lowest number that it's going to like spit out for a full-time job is going to be right there. So you can dig into this. I'm not going to walk through all the formulas and everything with this. You can do that. Feel free to shoot me questions if you get into it and you're like, I'm so confused about how this formula works or something. But the reason why we do this, the reason why this is included in a conversation about equity is that letting people negotiate their salaries is a really good way to short circuit equity within your spaces. And that, as I said a few minutes ago, there are some folks who are just trained societally to be really good at advocating for themselves. And lo and behold, those are the people that make the most money, in our sectors because they're really good at that. And so we make wages totally transparent and non-negotiable. So anybody on my staff can get into this spreadsheet and see exactly what their pay is based on. And I invite people to go ahead and look at it every once in a while and to see what those, if there are discrepancies between pay, this is what they're about. So this tool has been really invaluable, and I've, worked with a number of organizations to actually create a version of this for them. So I think, having something like this is the pathway to having it be really even-handed. And then it's not about the person and it's not about how pushy they are about something. You just say, this is what the wages are. There's also a lot of controversy around salary scales for that same reason, that again, if you give people the opportunity to be able to advocate for themselves, some people are going to be really good at taking that and other people aren't. And there tend to be very strong correlations with race and gender between who's actually going to go to bat for themselves. Okay. Okay, so then let's talk about raises. And so I said that there's three things that we do with our raises. One is that they're non-negotiable. The other is that they're automatic and that they account for cost of living rise. So each one of these things is really important. They're non-negotiable, again, because folks who are better at negotiating tend to have more societal power and privilege. They're automatic because we don't want to put people in a position where they have to advocate for themselves to get their needs met. So this is one of the ways that like a worker-centered culture is really different than a sort of org power structure centered culture. So I assume that if somebody is still employed with us after a year, they have gotten better at their job. They have gotten more efficient. They don't need to prove that to me. The fact that I have not fired them is proof enough that they are a more valuable employee to us now than they were a year ago. And if you don't account for the cost of living rise, you're functionally giving somebody a pay cut. This was a really big deal last year. So our raises last year were 11% because the cost of living rise in the year leading up to it had been like 8.5%. And so our raise is 3%. And then cost of living is tied directly to what the Bureau of Labor Statistics tell us was the cost of living rise that happened in the year prior to, like, leading up to the passage of our budget for the following year. So there's a little bit of a delay that happens with it because you might not get the raise until, like, almost a year after that cost of living rise happened. But then everybody on staff gets the same raise. And it's based on a really clear formula that we have and what the government tells us was the cost of living overall. So I've got this labeled the myth of meritocracy versus stats on pay gaps. And again, this is just about, like, what people are getting paid really has very little to do with, like, how good they are at their jobs. Typically, it has to do with who's good at advocating. If you're an advocacy organization, that might make sense, but most of us aren't. That was a joke. Okay, so this is just like the real data on our raise calculation. So this was 2023, our raise calculation. It was an 11.2% raise. This year, it's a 6.7% raise. And again, that is just 100% based on what the cost of living was plus 3%. So I said something about, like, pay transparency. So this is the information. This is actually a screenshot of the calculations that are in my budget document that the board approves, but the staff also has access to these spreadsheets. So they are able to see the calculations in a very transparent way, and they're able to see what everybody on staff is making. So I don't hide that information from people. And that's one of the things that I think makes it really easy for me to have, like, healthy conversations with people when they're like, I'm not making enough money. And I'm like, well, let's figure out how to bring everybody else up, because here's the deal. This is why you're getting paid what you're getting paid. And it's the same as the other program managers, for instance, are getting paid. And so this gives me the information that I need that's already shared with folks so that we can have really good conversations with each other. Okay, so the last of my 6 points about wage equity was always pay for all the work. So if folks aren't familiar with this term, wage theft is actually the largest category of material crime in the United States. This is anything that makes it so that people are not actually getting the full value of their labor. So it's minimum wage violations, it's overtime violations, which can include, I mean, it's not actually technically overtime violations, but one of the practices that often happens is that we hire people in to our jobs based on, like, this is a 20-hour-a-week job or a 30-hour-a-week job, but actually we expect them to work 28 hours or 60 hours a week. And that is our organizations not paying people for their full labor. It is one of the reasons why I've had multiple people who have applied for jobs with us say, like, I'm just really grateful that you have all of these clear policies in place, like our handbook, our employee handbook that we give people at any point in the hiring process that they want to see it clearly says you get paid for all of your hours here. And they're like, that's a change. That is very different from what I'm used to. There's more information. If you want to learn more about this, you can Google Civic Action as the organization that produced this batch of statistics. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears and talk about benefits next. Does anybody have any quick questions about wages? That was the wage portion. Okay, and I'm not seeing the chat number go up, so I'm assuming we're good. Okay, great. Okay, so benefits. So benefits really mean the ability to care for ourselves in, I'm going to be bold here and say, a country and a culture that largely leaves us to fend for ourselves. So the United States is the most individualistic culture in the world. If you study the sociology, there's a thing called the Hofstede Index that you can look that up and get a look at it. And part of what that means is that people are left to fend for themselves in a whole lot of ways. And one of the most important ways that that's true is with health insurance, that we expect employers to provide health insurance or people to just not have it. It's softened a little bit with the Affordable Care Act, but there's still many, many, many people falling between the cracks who don't have access to these things. And so this is a place where I wish it wasn't true, because in my organization's case, we're going to spend $67,000 on benefits next year for our employees, which is literally a whole other staff position that we could be doing. And this is the reality. And so your folks' ability to care for themselves partly depends on what kind of benefits you're offering. There's a link down here that you'll get in the slideshow that will actually take you to an article that I just wrote for our newsletter that's talking about the health insurance thing. So if you want to go down a little more of a rabbit hole, you can go to that link and go ahead and find that article. But benefits are really, really important. So one of the practices that I think is important is actually directly asking people what they want and need. And so we do a benefits, let me get to it here. So we do a benefit survey each year where I ask the staff, I tell them, here's our current benefits for reference, and then give them a whole list of things that we could add. I collect this information as a survey, ask them what their top choices are, ask them if they want to advocate for anything for other people on the team. So for instance, we have our staff at this point is about half parents and half not parents. And so we had a bunch of the non-parents saying, like, actually, I would really support us having some sort of childcare dependent account for people, which we've added. And that was mostly because of the advocacy of non-parents on the staff. And so I don't make them have to choose between advocating for themselves and advocating for others on staff. I also asked this question about, from a justice and equity standpoint, which of the potential benefits do you think we should all be advocating for? So I do like a fairly nuanced thing each year where I ask people what it is that they want us to do around our benefits. And so this year we added dental coverage, we added an FSA account, and we added a child care, a dependent care account for folks. So those were the things that they chose. I was a little surprised if I had just predicted based on articles that I read about benefits that are most valuable, I probably would have done like a retirement account thing. Well, it turns out like people didn't really want that. They wanted these other things. And you don't know that unless you ask your people what they actually want, and not make a lot of assumptions about what people's needs are based on what you think you know about them, but just ask them. So I strongly suggest doing that. And so these are some examples of the kinds of things that could be on that benefit survey, but you'll again got the link where you can go directly to that survey and you can see the kinds of things that we're talking about. But I think the core thing here is asking what people actually need. The other thing is asking yourself some key questions. So at what hours and or wage salary level do people start being able to access benefits? And again, we try to do it so that everybody can do that if they're working at least 17 and a half hours for us. So they get identical benefits to somebody working 40 hours a week. And the underlying question here goes back to one of those core questions that I said at the beginning, which is, are you structuring things to dodge employee care or to codify employee care? And, as much as possible, if you can try to like lean into codifying it instead of dodging it, that's going to be one of the things that has you become a really good place to work. So I live in a town of 10,000 people. That's where my organization is. It is a small rural town. I hear constant complaints from other food systems professionals about how they can't get people to apply for jobs. I have no problem getting people to apply for jobs with the food web. We have a deep pool of candidates pretty much every time we put something out there. And the number one thing that I am told in the hiring process is that it's because of our benefits. And it's hugely impactful for actually getting good staff and retaining good staff. We also have, I mean, fingers crossed, a really good staff retention at this point. And, we're only a year and a half into the era where I've been like trying to put these things in place. But I have not lost any core staff in that year and a half, and nobody looks like they're going anywhere anytime soon. And I think a lot of it is because we create a culture where we are codifying care in a whole bunch of different ways. Okay, so let's talk about paid time off. So I know probably a lot of your farmers markets don't offer this. If you've just got seasonal folks or you're just having folks who work just on the weekends, I can understand that this might not be a hot topic for you. For those of you who have year-round staff, though, this is one of the other interesting topics to talk about. So paid time off is, you're going to lean into equity the more flexible you can set it up to be, for a number of reasons. And that's, the first one is probably, the first couple are probably the most important ones. So not everybody's meaningful holidays are the same. We have done this second bullet, where we have disconnected office and program closures from days off. So for instance, we don't expect people to answer the phone if they're in here on Martin Luther King Day or on Christmas Eve or whatever, because our office is closed, but folks can work on those days if they want to. And we have, other than, I think that Christmas and Thanksgiving were the only 2 days where nobody worked in this past cycle, because they all had family stuff going on of different sorts. But literally, I have people who work all of the major other holidays because they really like the quiet office and not having anybody else bug them. And they don't get dinged for that holiday on their PTO count if they don't take it. So we have completely disconnected, when the office is closed, from major standard United States holidays from how our PTO is administered. The second thing is, the next thing is sort of a cluster of like what people's needs are. So one of the things that I think is important is to recognize that like mental health is just as real as physical health. And there are some days where people just cannot do it. And I make it clear to my staff that a mental health day is a perfectly reasonable, perfectly good reason for taking a day off. Just like if you've got a fever, you're hacking up a lung, whatever, the things that we're like, well, of course you wouldn't come to work when you're really sick. Well, for some people, the more significant version of that is that they have mental health days where they just can't really do it. So different people are going to use it in different ways. Some people take time off for family, for those holidays. Some people need mental health days a couple times a month. Some people save it up and they take 2 solid weeks off. It's perfectly fine for them to structure their time off however they want to. One of the things I do is I require a minimum use of PTO, because I think everybody needs a certain amount of detox from, I'm calling it internalized capitalism. What I mean is that obsessive need to be in productive mode all of the time. And so I tell everybody when they come in as a new hire, I expect you to take 1 full week off at some point. And I'm going to track that and make sure that you're doing it. How else they use their PTO is fine. They can do that however they want. But our newest employee, when I told him that, he was like, "You're kidding me." Like, you actually, wait, you said require to take that? I was like, yes, I'm going to require you to do that at some point. One of the things I don't require are doctor's notes or any authority other than the employee themselves telling me when they need to take time off. So that practice, I hope nobody is still doing that. So let me affirm if you aren't doing that anymore, that I'm really glad that you're not doing it. A lot of people can't afford to go to a doctor in order to get them to sign a note that says that it is okay for them to take time off. So please don't set it up where you have to spend money in order to be able to access your PTO. Deeply classist practice. One of the things that this means, though, is that we need to cross-train essential functions. So our biggest struggle with having this policy work in the last year was that we only had one market manager. And so she literally could not be gone on a Thursday, or we had to close the market down. 6 months into my being here, we started actively cross-training so that that doesn't happen. And now almost everybody on staff would pitch in if she happened to be sick at the last minute, because we all know how to do some parts of the market function. And we have just hired a market co-manager so that both of them will now be able to take that time off. So really cross-training so that PTO can be a real thing, or sick days can be a real thing. And finally, this is what we do. We bundle our hours or days for maximum flexibility. So I say, you've got this many PTO hours based on how many hours you're contracted for, and you can use those for vacation, you can use those for holidays, you can use those for sick time, including mental health days. I don't care how you use it, here's your bundle. And that gives the maximum flexibility. Okay, so questions about that. I've seen lots of the chat numbers have been steadily rising. So what's going on in the chat?
Yeah, there are a few questions that have stacked up. Since we were just talking about paid time off, I'm going to start with that question, and then I'll go back to some of the ones that were on different subjects. But one person asked, how do we support the idea of taking time off for salary employees? And if you need more information, you can ask the person to say more.
Yeah, why don't you unmute? Because to me, that's actually easier to figure out how to do than hourly in some ways. So yeah, go ahead and say more.
Well, I was just wondering about, like, if we're not charging, or if we're not paying an hourly position, there's just a salary amount that they're getting, then how do we culturally, like, build in the support of, like, ensuring that people taking wellness time and sick time when they're sick. And I think when you started to talk about cross training, that partially feels like a good thing to make sure that it's possible for them to take time off. But I was just wondering if there's any other thoughts that you have about kind of encouraging an atmosphere of, like, of people everybody taking care of themselves.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks for that. Thanks for that added context. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's going to come down to your senior leadership, which may be a weird term if you only have a couple people in your market hierarchy. But I think, like, so I model walking out of the office at the end of my 7-hour day. So I'm on a 35-hour week, and I am really clear about modeling for people that I don't work over my 35 hours, or if I do, they see me take a day off the next week. So I think a lot of it is like the modeling of the people who actually are approving vacation time is going to be one of the key pieces. The other thing would be that thing of, like, requiring a minimum amount of PTO to get used. And I know that, like, sometimes people, particularly like executive directors are terrible about this. Senior program managers are terrible about this. Like, a lot of us, like, really dig our jobs and we're really into it, and we want to work more hours than is healthy for us. And I think, like, what's helped me the most is actually, I use the phrase internalized capitalism a lot. Like, if you've been on staff with me for more than a few months, you're starting to think in those terms of, like, my contribution to my job has nothing to do with my self-worth, and really, like, disconnecting those things from each other. So opening up conversations where we talk about this stuff and we talk about how we've been trained to overwork, I think is one of the things that can really help with that cultural piece. And so I think it's modeling, I think it's policy, and I think it's talking about it in terms of, like, cultural paradigms. All those can really help. And, if somebody is, like, really not taking care of themselves, I have occasionally just flat out told an employee to go home. Like, you are glazed over, you are struggling, you need to go home. And I sometimes just, like, kick people out of the office when they're not taking very good care of themselves. So I don't know if that helps or not. I think it's a whole cultural package that we're talking about.
Another question on PTO was, do you front load the employee PTO package?
Yeah, so we don't front load it as far as like their official balance. So we have we do our payroll through Gusto, and Gusto like does automatic accrual with each pay period of somebody's hours. But what I do tell people when they first get hired in is that if they already have vacation planned, go ahead and take it, and we will just manually correct that in the system. So we don't have like a formal standard thing every year with front loading it, but I do try to make sure that people in their first 6 months are able to take time off. But we handle it, our formal system is more rigid than our like practices around that particular thing. So I just let people use some hours ahead of time, and then we adjust it in the system as we go. So it's an accounting issue. Yeah, but they start accruing PTO right away. So I think that's another practice that's pretty bad, is that sometimes it's like, you have to have been on the job for X amount of time before you can take a vacation. And I'm like, do you have any idea how stressful the first 6 months on a job are for people? Like, really? That time when they probably need it the most, you're going to say you can't take time off. Bad practice. Definitely bad practice.
Yana, there are some questions that go back to the raises and pay scale, and I don't want to lose those. Do we have time to do a couple more questions?
Yeah,
right?
let's go ahead and do them. Yeah.
Okay, so one person asked, for your organization, does that mean you make sure to cap people at the number of prescribed working hours, or do you pay for extra, or both? And I think
Yeah, so different organizations are going to handle this differently, and different states are going to have different amount of like rigidity of requirements around having to pay people overtime. The way that we handle it internally is that I get everybody to self-correct within each pay period. We pay once a month, and I want to see your hours evened out over the course of that month. So if somebody works, if somebody's contracted for 32 hours and they work 35 one week, I'm going to be like, okay, so which of the next couple of weeks are you picking up those hours, or are you going to take a full day off and only count a half day of vacation? So we just try to like correct for it kind of as we go, to try to make sure that people are staying even in terms of their hours. Did that answer it? I'm not sure I'm totally answering your question.
wait and see if they
Okay, if they pop up again. Okay.
but or maybe they can follow up with you afterwards, because we do have a few more questions and you have the rest of your
I do. I got a few more things I want to get through. Okay.
The other question was, what about salary scales based on increased experience or education for upward mobility within the same role?
So I would create a different role for the person and run it through the matrix as that role that has the additional responsibility. And so it's not that that person is stuck at that, whatever that starting salary level is. It's like they can advance within the organization. Like I've had two employees that just in the last couple of weeks have had, have gotten promotions, and we created a new job description that reflected those new responsibilities. We ran that new job description through the matrix, and that was where they got that additional, that's where their additional pay is coming from at this point. So you still stick with the matrix and use it as your tool for pay setting, but you just recognize that the person has moved into a different domain within the organization or the business.
And then the last one for right now is, should everyone expect a raise every year? How do you find funding to keep increasing consistently as a nonprofit?
Yeah, I mean, I think because the cost of living is going to go up every year, I think that people deserve to get raises every year. And that's really hard to keep up with. And I absolutely get that. And so, you have to find ways to, like, if you do some kind of fees that are built in for your services, you may have to raise the fees in alignment with cost of living as well, so that, the money that's coming into your farmer's market is allowing you to pay people more. In our case, it's, I prioritized hiring a really good grant writer as, one of our core staff positions. And so, she and I are responsible for keeping up with it and keeping up with the fundraising. And that definitely is challenging. But the thing is, if we don't take responsibility to do that, we are externalizing that responsibility to swallow the cost of living increases onto the individuals that work for us. And so I would rather have us solve the problem collectively rather than everybody having to solve it individually. So that's one way that you can think about finding the money to do those increases. I do think that there's a lot of work to do. If you're in the nonprofit sector like I am, I think there's a lot of work to do with funders to like get them to understand that we actually need you to give more money than you gave last year, because the cost of living has increased and because we're doing our best to take care of our people. And some funders will play and some won't. So you may have to write more grants in order to be able to keep up with that, but you might also be able to do some advocacy work with the folks who are providing your funding to actually help them understand some of this stuff too. So we can ripple some of this advocacy out ultimately foundations are hugely influential over how much we can actually do this equity stuff. I do think it helps to frame it as an equity issue, though. I mean, that's definitely been what's been the best in that I've had for talking to foundations and other funders about, yep, we need you to be giving more this year than you gave last year.
Okay, I think if you want to keep going with your
All
presentation.
right, great. Those are great questions. Thank you, everybody. Okay, so this slide is just labeled policies for the people because I just wanted to use that phrase at some point. So now I get to use it. Thinking about like, there's a bunch of other stuff that kind of go into creating a culture that is really worker centered and is, and by that, to some extent, what I'm talking about is like having a culture that works for the actual beings who are on your staff rather than trying to do like a cookie cutter kind of setup of like everybody's having to do things in exactly the same way. So one of the things that we do is we allow as much work from home as possible without compromising the work. This may be a little bit different for us than it is for a lot of you because our market is one of 5 programs that we do. So not all of my staff is market staff. My market staff members have to be in the office on Wednesdays and Thursdays because those are the days when we're receiving produce and, receiving all of the food for our market and then fulfilling those orders. So they are the only people on staff, though, that have an absolute requirement where they must be in the office on particular days. Everybody else is a mix of work from home and being in the office. And I'm probably the one who is most consistently in the office. And that's a responsibility that I'm taking because I want to be available for my staff. But pretty much everybody else has on average, I'd say a day a week where they're working from home. It doesn't affect their ability to get their jobs done, so we can be flexible about it. Also allowing for flex time, allowing somebody to do that thing of like they work, an extra long week and then they get to take it easy the next week. And that's fine. And also individually determining their schedules. Actually, I have a piece of paper on my desk right now where I'm trying to sort out exactly what people's schedules are because they've shifted a lot. And that's because I'm not saying everybody has to be here from 9 to 5 every day. So I have, a couple of people who always work from home on Mondays. I have somebody who typically works from home on Fridays. And then a couple of people who play it by ear and they let me know in the morning whether they're at home or at the office, and it's totally fine. So it depends to some extent on what the job is, but they get to determine their schedule based on their hours, and they get to determine how much they're at home. So if you have employees, like our full-time is 32 hours a week. And so we have one person who's doing 4-day-a-week work week. And then we have other people who have spread that out in shorter 5-day work week days. Have one person who prefers to do a little bit of work on the weekends because that helps her feel more grounded on Monday morning. And so she gets to do that. So one of the other things is that we are often really bad about making sure that we are fulfilling our federally mandated requirements that people get breaks. So make sure that people are getting their breaks, and or make sure that people are just allowed to take care of themselves. Like I have somebody who doesn't often take a break, but they are totally comfortable leaving 15 minutes early, or they know that they're going to get a call at some point from their partner during the day, and they just know that that's going to be their break, and it's going to happen whenever that call comes during the day, whenever they're kind of coordinating their domestic life. That's totally fine. I just make sure nobody is like pushing themselves to the point where they clearly need a break and they're not taking it. So really paying attention to what people's actual bodily needs are is pretty important. So don't dictate irrelevant things. Boy, lots of jobs are still like, they have dress codes when there's absolutely no reason to. It's like, we work with farmers. Nobody cares what we're wearing. You know, it's like, don't dictate stuff that doesn't affect the work. Some jobs say you can't sit down. Some jobs say you can't stand up. And it's like, why are we dictating these things when it's like people's bodies have different needs? I have ADHD. I have a game on my phone that I play when I get stressed out. And so somebody might walk in my office and I'm literally playing a game on my phone. This is how I take my break time during the day, is in little 5-minute chunks when my brain gets overloaded. So it's like, if that's what somebody is going to need in order to keep good attention and good focus, let them do that thing. Now, obviously, if somebody's not doing their job, that's a conversation you're going to need to have, but a bunch of this stuff doesn't really matter. The other thing is making sure that you have developed health and safety plans to ensure that the work environment is actually safe. So, you know, making sure you're addressing slip hazards, making sure that you're addressing, you know, if you've got, you know, you run a farmer's market, there's going to be days that's going to be really hot. And, you know, do people have access to cold water? Do people have access to shade? Making sure that you're actually building health and safety plans into how you're structuring people's work. Okay, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about hours. So one of the cultural things, I would call this internalized capitalism, says that hard work is a virtue and working extra hours is indicative of your commitment. And yeah, I call bullshit. Like, I don't think that's actually true. And there's a lot of data at this point to back it up. If you decide to click through to this link, there's a fascinating list of ways that people try to weasel out of actually being where they, you know, you're appearing productive without actually doing anything. It's kind of a fun list. The data says that like most people are truly deeply productive for about 3 hours a day. I try to like recognize that this is part of the we're mammals, not robots part of it. And so looking at ways that you can potentially keep people's pay the same and maybe have them actually work less hours. And you may actually be getting the exact amount of productive work from people in that reduced amount of time. I'm on a 35-hour work week because for me, there is a qualitative difference between an 8-hour day and a 7-hour day. Like that 8th hour is really, really hard for me. I have a chronic illness and I have a really hard time making it to the 8-hour mark and still feeling like I'm there. Typically, I have 6 really productive hours and a 7th hour where, you know, I clean my office or I futz around or I shuffle papers around or I organize stuff, like stuff that doesn't really take me being in full productive mode, or I just let myself be a little less productive for that hour. So really taking some time to think about like, how much time do people actually need to be present, doing their thing? Obviously, when your market's open, you need people to be present and doing your things. Other times, though, there may be work that you can do in fewer hours and actually get the same amount of real productivity from it. Okay, so the last major topic that I want to talk about is job postings and applications, and particularly thinking about like how equity is related to how we do job postings. So there's a couple things. These are some best practices with job postings. So first of all, disclose the salary and benefits. I don't know how many times I have seen job postings where I'm like, that's a really interesting job. And they're saying salary is competitive. Like, just tell people what you're going to pay them. Like, it's really unfair to everybody and wastes a lot of time because often you'll put people through a hiring process and then it turns out you can't actually pay them what they need. And you have literally just wasted everybody's time. In some cases, many hours of time on the part of the person who was doing the application. Also, Washington State did kind of a sneaky thing last year or I guess the year before now, where they passed a law saying that you must disclose the salary and benefits of any job that anyone living in Washington State might apply for. It pretty much means they sneaky made it so that everybody in the country needs to actually post salary and benefits. And the benefits need to not just say there are benefits, but actually spell out in a little bit of detail what those things are, what the benefits are. I've already said this, that salary wages open the door for wage biases. I don't think I'm going to repeat that again. So you cannot discriminate against a protected class. I'll give you a little bit of the legalese here on this in a second, but this includes not including things in postings, and organizations still do this. Businesses still say, we're seeking women to do blah, blah, blah secretarial work. It still happens. You also can't say you're seeking recent college graduates because age is in that protected class area, and that implies that you're looking for young people who can work for very little money. That's really what that's implying. You can't actually do that. You can't ask application questions that are going to push someone to disclose membership in a protected class. So that's related to that last one. And then a growing practice is getting away from asking for cover letters. Cover letters are kind of a trap. It's like you're basically saying, write us a one-page letter with zero guidance and tell us what we want to hear. And we're not going to tell you what we want to hear. So if you get it right, we'll give you an interview. And if you get it wrong, you won't. It's not a very good way to sort out who is actually a good match with the work. The joke is, unless mind reading is a job requirement, don't ask them for cover letters, ask specific questions. So I usually give them, answer these 4 questions in about a page, and don't worry about formatting it as a cover letter. Again, unless the job actually requires you to be able to write to a particular formula, having people organize it as a cover letter is not necessarily going to give you relevant information about who they would be as an employee. I also really try to accurately disclose the state of equity work within the organization in postings and/or interviews. This is particularly important if you are interested in, or would value having people of color on your staff, or, people with disabilities, or members of the LGBTQIA+ community. It's important to us to know what we are walking into in organizations. And so I try to disclose that as best I can. Okay, so let's talk about the tricky one here, which is colorblind hiring. So I don't think it's a thing. I think we all see color. I think we try to pretend sometimes that we don't. So I don't think that that's actually a goal. I think that our goal as hiring entities is to see the person who's in front of us and to really be curious about how all of the person's experience could potentially benefit them in the role. When we try to be colorblind, what we're trying to do is to actually unsee some really important parts of that person's life experience. So life experience matters, and it should matter to our work. Here's the actual legalese, and I'm not going to read it because you can get these slides and read it, but there are some very specific things that you have to be careful about in a hiring process. And this is why you can't ask questions that ask somebody to disclose this or make it so that they have to disclose. So you don't want to ask any questions that are going to produce a response that would indicate an applicant's protected class status. So it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of race. So you can't ask those questions. You can't post jobs in a way that indicate what type of person you're looking for. And you can't hire or not hire someone because they are of a particular race. That does not mean that you can't take into account relevant lived experience. The key to making that work is to genuinely value varied life experiences. And, in the case of organizations and businesses that serve a particular population, lived experience with the issues that you're working to address is actually relevant to the job. The other thing is that opportunity in interesting workplaces is uneven. And so when we're doing really conscious hiring practices, we have the opportunity to even out some of that unevenness. So I do think about, I had a hiring situation once where, we had two really good candidates and one of them was a white woman. In the nonprofit sector, white women are a dime a dozen. We are most of the nonprofit sector. The other person was a Latino man who is like literally the least well-represented population other than Indigenous men in the nonprofit sector. And given the choice between the two, I did lean toward providing an opportunity for someone who typically wouldn't have gotten it. And these were two completely well-qualified candidates. And his Spanish was better. And that was really important to the job. And so I genuinely valued his particular life experience, which was that he was Spanish fluent. And I also recognized that I could help even out some unevenness in opportunity in my sector. So here's some examples of questions that you can ask as long as they are relevant to the job. What experience do you have working with a particular population? Have you worked or lived in racially diverse communities? What would qualify you to work with a particular community? Do you speak Spanish? Totally legit question. We have an explicit goal about becoming a more diverse organization, but we're really in process with that. Have you worked with that context before, and how was that? This last question might be borderline. I have asked occasionally when someone has already disclosed that they're a BIPOC person, how would you feel about working in a predominantly white organization? Because that can be really tough. And are there particular things that you would need to have in order to have that go well? That one might be borderline. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not advising you on any of this in terms of like legal advice, but I do think that thinking through like, how can I ask questions that make it clear that I'm going to value somebody's experience? How do I do that? So these are some examples of those questions that these I think are totally fine. This one might be fine. I'm not actually sure, but I've done it before. So maybe don't do what I do, but we're all in this together, just trying to do our best, I think. Okay, so questions about that last section about job postings and hiring processes? Okay, we'll move on. Okay. Okay, so evaluations and reviews. And this is pretty standard stuff. Everybody needs and deserves compassionate and direct feedback. So I'm not even going to necessarily read through all of these. I will say this one though, that, if you're providing critical feedback for somebody, please give them some way to like do something with that feedback. Just being critical without giving people a pathway to change is actually kind of bad management just in general. So really thinking through how can I help somebody do better in their job, I think is a really important piece of it. For me, evaluations, one of the purposes is to get people more comfortable giving and receiving feedback, including hard feedback. Part of it, though, is making sure that people's job descriptions and work plans are actually up to date. And so I use annual reviews as an opportunity to talk through how is your job going and do we need to make any changes to your job? So really gearing it toward how am I helping this person grow as a professional, rather than how am I using it as a way to like punish people or give people hard feedback, I think is really important. And this is another reason why, like, in order to have it be a container that really emphasizes their growth, disconnecting it from whether they're going to get a raise or not is really important. People can be more vulnerable and ask for what they need more if they're not worried that their boss is going to take it the wrong way and not give them a raise because they asked for something. Okay, so last thing, unions are a good thing. I want to encourage folks to consider that, even if you implement all of this stuff, you will not be there forever. And giving your employees a way to actually advocate for themselves is a good thing. I know a lot of folks feel really threatened by unionization. A lot of managers do. And I think if we're talking about codifying employee care, though, a union is one of the best ways to do that. And actually making that a permanent long-term shift in your organizational culture where it is okay to advocate for what you want and need. And we're going to create a way for you to do that. The link that's in here is for the Nonprofit Workers Union. So there is such a thing. Ooh, I've been talking a lot. There is a nonprofit union, workers union. I'm in the process of broaching this topic with my employees. I can't be part of the union because I am management, but I can encourage them and let them know that I'm not going to resist it if they decide to create a union. Okay, one more thing, which is just, I have this resource if you like how I think about things and are interested in learning more about the kinds of culture building framework. This is my co-authored book, The Cooperative Culture Handbook. And that link again will be in the slides for you if you want to check that out. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing. And we have like 10 minutes. Oh my gosh, I've missed so many things going on in the chat.
There's a lot of comments and things, people talking about their experience and things like that. But there is a question about please go back to ranges, but I'm thinking that that person might have missed the beginning of your presentation. And when we send out the review, that maybe they could review that part in the recording and the slides, because you do go into depth about setting wages and using a matrix.
Yeah, Rebecca, is there a particular question? Okay. Okay, well, feel free to reach out to me. Here, I'm gonna drop my whoop. Org. Okay, that's my email. Feel free to reach out to me if you do have more questions about some of this stuff after you get done looking at the early part of the recording.
But do other people have follow-up questions on anything that was said or things that they need added to what they heard today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Emily Lyson is saying like that phrase, depending on experience. Says I usually private message the poster and tell them they'll get more applicants if they list the wage range. Yeah. Yep, you definitely will. You definitely will.
Lisa has a question. And also there's a question about insight on worker-owned businesses.
Oh, love worker-owned businesses. Okay, what was the question somebody wanted to ask?
Yeah, sorry, I was just gonna talk because I would have just rambled in the chat. So I'll ramble in person. I guess I am constantly struggling with how to, get enough money to give raises, but also be implementing more programs without raising stall fees, because that just doesn't seem sustainable to us. And we're at a point where we're a fairly large farmers market and we don't necessarily want to grow to be a giant one. So just kind of constantly playing and finding that balance, I think is something I think about a lot. And I
Yeah,
guess wanted to know if you had any more thoughts on that.
yeah, I mean, I think, and Lisa, this is a really good point. I think it can be a big hump to get over. And if you're not a nonprofit and you can't apply for grants, or you're not eligible for like the USDA funding that, can actually really help. I mean, for-profit farmers markets can apply for some of that USDA funding. And so I would encourage folks to look at whether there's a way that you can get some infusion from the federal government. I mean, I would much rather have my taxes go to your employees getting paid more than a bunch of other stuff that it goes to. So I don't think that for-profit should feel bad about taking that route. I would look at one of the things that I've seen some groups do is look at whether you can go from a 40-hour-a-week expectation to a 35-hour-a-week expectation without lowering people's actual pay so that the dollar per hour goes up. And that's one way that, I mean, if all of those studies are right, that people are just as efficient, in 35 hours as they are in 40 hours, then that's one way that you could do it. And, and I know some organizations that have experimented with it. They've said, like, let's try the 35-hour work week for 3 months and see what happens. Do we notice a significant drop off in how much we're being able to get done? And then you evaluate it together at the end of those 3 months and you say, like, was this better? Was it easier for you to do that? And, and some people are like, well, I wasn't making enough money in the first place, so this isn't actually helping me. But now they have a little bit of time to pick up a side gig if they want it, I mean, I think there's ways that you can get creative with it. I do also think that it's possible to, like, you may be able to, like, do some crowdsourcing from people who shop at the farmer's market and say, like, we're wanting to improve wages, can people pitch in to be able to help with that? I mean, you get I mean, most of our markets get a lot of people that come through every week. And, some of those people are going to get it about this kind of stuff and potentially be willing to help. So that could be one way to do it.
There's a question asking, what can you share about the difference between salaried and wage-based compensation?
I mean, so there are some, like, legal requirements around who actually has to be salaried that varies from state to state. So not necessarily knowing all of the background for everywhere that people are. I don't want to misspeak for a particular person's situation. So, basically it's the difference between, are you asking people to track all of their hours and get paid for the amount of hours that they actually did, versus there's a general expectation of some amount of hours that you think it's going to take to get the work done, and people get paid the same amount, like, steadily all the time. So I guess I'm not sure what all is behind the question. That was OFMA Communications. Sure. Okay, I'm going to talk about worker ownership for a minute. And if there's a follow-up on that one, happy to take a follow-up on it. Yeah, so becoming a worker-owned business when it reaches a certain scale. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, so different states have different levels of support for worker ownership actually being a legal structure that you can do. There are worker-owned entities that are state-level nonprofits. There are worker-owned entities that are LLCs, and there are worker-owned entities that are, I mean, you can pretty much do it with any kind of corporate structure. And then there's ones that are actually in a state. Like California has really good laws around worker ownership structures, and really good, like, structures that are, like, codified in the law. And so, yeah, the idea is basically that, there's no difference between, that the workers are the owners. So there's no difference between, like, the owners and the workers in terms of who's getting the benefit, who's getting profit from it, how profit sharing is happening. Management is often done democratically. Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of stuff to it. If you're in Washington or Oregon, there's the Northwest Cooperative Development Association. I don't know what the last letter is, but Northwest Cooperative Development. And they are a really excellent resource out here for, like, Washington and Oregon to be able to help make that transition to worker ownership. I think, when you're talking about, like, equity and justice stuff, like, worker ownership is absolutely one of the best ways to go. Okay, so I'm going to pop back to this difference between salary. Oh, how it might be inequitable. Well, so either wage-based or salaried can be inequitable. I mean, with salaried positions, sometimes you're exempt. If you're exempt from overtime, then a salaried position can actually get you into a lot of trouble where you can end up being paid for 40 hours and only working 60. I think if you are attending to doing your wage setting in a way that is equitable, then you're gonna eliminate a lot of the problems, I think, that come from like wage-based issues with it. Although if you're thinking of something in particular, sounds like maybe you're thinking of something in particular, whoever's asking this question about wage-based compensation being inequitable. Do you want to say a little more? Mhm. Yeah, Lisa, I appreciate Lisa Hall's comment here about we have most of our employees on salary, even if they're very part-time, it makes it easier for them to know what they'll get each month. I let people decide whether they want to be paid hourly or salaried, other than like the upper management positions that are legally required to be that. And mostly people have chosen to be salaried. But I leave that up to them. It depends on what works better. I still have the same expectations though that you're, keeping your hours to the amount of hours that you're contracted for and not going over. So I might be a little bit of a tight control freak as far as that particular piece goes, which makes the differences a little less glaring, I think, between the two models. Okay, well, we are at 1:30. So, or whatever 30, wherever you are, Michigan, New York, Oregon. So I'm gonna wrap up and, thank you, everybody. So Amanda's gonna share the slides and the recording, and Amanda, you can also feel free to reshare my email address again. I am incredibly swamped right now, so I might be a little bit of a slow email correspondent over the next few weeks as I'm getting through some stuff, but I promise I will get back to you if anybody reaches out to me. Thank you for your good attention today, everybody. I appreciate it, and I hope this was helpful.
Thank you, Yana. And thank you everyone for coming. It was so good to see all of you.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.